So please join me in welcoming Mr. Pinelo.
Thank you for that introduction and the welcome. Sure. I think we could put this on this side. Yeah, that makes it better. Thank you for the patience and for sharing your time with me. I'm very pleased that I was invited to this COBEC conference and to actually be part of the organizing committee through John Paul II Junior College. And I must say here that I also appreciate very much that Mayor Rosales, who is present here, along with Councilors Alvarado, Iglesias, Cocom, and Deputy Mayor Garcia, when I mentioned it to them that we were invited to be part of this, they were, and as you can see, they are very supportive. We consider, and I'm speaking on behalf of the mayor and council and councilors, we are very pleased that John Paul II Junior College and Benque Viejo were chosen for this conference. For many, it may be a first. For us in Benque, we hope that this is going to be the first one before another one comes to town. As to you, our guests and professors, as Mayor Rosales mentioned this morning, on behalf of the council, we welcome you. We hope those of you who are on media at this point, that at some point in time, you're going to come to Benque Viejo to visit not only John Paul II Junior College, but the entire community and the surrounds. And so when the Dean, Mr. David Ruiz, invited me to share based on works I've done, I said, of course, I will. And I'm very glad that I see persons that I've worked with. I appreciate very much the opportunities you have given me at your institutions, the collegiality that we have had working with you. And so that adds to it. And I also, I'm glad that my cousin, Dr. Ludwig Palacio from Belmopan is here. And so for those of you out in media land, thank you and I hope that I can share a lot and that what I say makes more sense than what I have already been speaking about. At the risk of sounding like a tour guide or a regular history lecturer, I opted to share a narrative of what matters to me personally, and I believe that it is what matters to COBEC in the field of education, and in particular as it deals with history. And so I hope that as I share this aspect of Belizean story, Belizean history, that it will encourage you in your institutions to get students to come into Belize, and those of us who are already in Belize to get our students to develop a deeper interest into research and interpretation of aspects of our story that has not been looked at. The official story of Belize, or at least that which has been transmitted to many of us from primary school days, tends to omit a large portion of our story. And so indeed, in schools we teach his story. When will we make it ours? For those of us who grew up in the era before independence, we find when I go back into it that there is a hiatus between what is the late Maya post-classic period and the early 18th century. That portion of our history, for whatever reasons, and when we begin to look at it deeply, we realize that there are political, that there are economic, and that there are other reasons for why that element of our story was left out. And so when I look at further deep into this, the position that this position of history, where there is a gap between the 16th and the late 18th century in our history, skips a very important section, and especially if we are interested in who our ancestors are, all the more reason for us to look at it. Our story focuses more on a position that allowed for the arrival of the English, British adventurers, which now we can say pirates. I remember in one lecture somebody said, why do you use that word? But in reality, that is what led to, that is a part of the Anglo-Spanish conflict that affected our area. And so it has been used to justify that Europeans came to this territory and that they found it as terra nullius, nobody living there. In the books that we read, authors like Stephen Kiger, E. Winzerling, among others, and even the later versions of the government printers publication entitled A Sketch of British Honduras, which was very popular in primary schools, as I have spoken to elders in interviewing them, promulgated that here was a key-filled zone, and I pun on the word key, C-A-Y-E, a key-filled zone in the Western Caribbean just south of the Yucatan Peninsula and a little north of what is now the Republic of Honduras. And this is what we learned in school. The Maya were here for a time, there's a gap, and then the arrival of the English. And so that colonial history then promulgated our epochs and missed out a lot. And it largely ignored what happened between the 16th and the 19th century. It is the work of later archaeologists, historians, and general researchers, and for many of us, like myself, and as we all know, we grew up in an oral society, a place where our elders would tell us their stories. And because those were not documented, then it seems that they would have no validity. But we know different. We understand that the inclusion of oral history with documentary history enriches our knowledge of the past. And so we begin to highlight new information that archaeologists, historians, and general researchers begin to posit, especially those aspects between the 16th and 19th century of Western Belize. It brings out people like the likes of John Eric S. Thompson, who was Belize's first archaeological commissioner. And with the trend in Belize, the changes that brought in individuals like our very own Dr. Joseph Palacio, the first Belizean archaeological commissioner. And later on, Mr. Harriot Topsy, who became the archaeological commissioner for Belize. Later on, we see Dr. Jaime Awem, of whom many of you were listening to his presentation earlier. So those changes then show that there is that interest at different levels to further understand what Belize is like. Other historians, Roy Scholes, Grant Jones, Narda Dodson, the famous A History of Belize that we read in high school. And for me, in particular, Marcella Mazzarelli's work, her thesis with the University of Chicago at Champaign, speaking about Benque and the surrounds caught my attention. Indeed, a lot of these works are not readily available in our libraries. And hopefully, these and other sources will begin to appear more and more soon. Some of these books then, because of the laws that were in place, they were required to submit copies of their works. And consequently, we find that many of these works are indeed available in some instances. Later works published include those archaeological, historical, and sociological material that focus on Belize by the likes of Joseph Palacio, Angel Cal, Ines Sanchez, Leo Bradley, Jesuits like Father John Stokely, Father Richard Bueller, Father Richard Haddle, among others, whose work were published in, remember those little booklets, National Studies, which eventually became Belizean Studies. I had the opportunity of working with a young man, Michael Bradley of the Belize National Library and Service, Belize National Library and Information Service at the Heritage Library in Belmopan. That collection is now being digitized. We see the works and the input of Belizean authors into the late 1970s, early 1980s in what would become the Explorer series, a series of history-based books by Kubola Productions. The content of many of these writings challenged the status quo vis-a-vis the colonial view of Belize's story over the past 3 centuries. Okay. Yeah, and even so, I noticed today there's a Facebook page, the Belize National Historical Society. An excellent page, but sometimes when you see the commentaries that are set out by some people, you will agree with me that there are those who still prefer to bail out the dory and not take in those elements of our story that make Belize and Belizeans who we are. Later on, we see the professional academic exchange programs. We see the birth of institutions like Belcast, later on UCB and now UB. A number of those Belizeans that I mentioned earlier are engaged in the teaching of Belizean history, courses that attracted many of us. Publications like the Belcast Journal of Belizean Affairs, later on Spear Reports, even the articles in the newspaper. There we go. Thank you. Yeah, I was saying I've had the opportunity to visit the archives in Jamaica, their National Library too, as well as the archives of Central America in Guatemala City. I had the opportunity to also visit on the Mexican side many of the sources, and some of these are now available online. And it is based on those works that I've done, along with information from our very own Belize Archives and Records and Services institution, that I use, and I'm trying to combine some more work, some more information of what it is, of what it was like in Belize during the 16th and 19th centuries, particularly in northern, central, western Belize. So what I present herein, I know it's been a long introduction, follows a chronological sequence with primary and secondary sources. I know that I did all this to set the backdrop of the presentation, and in noting that most of it was ignored in the official story. After all, like I said before, it was his story. I hope that you can see it as our story. Oops. Following the Maya era, we find that in Belize, the remains of Spanish Christian churches like those at Lamanay and at Tipu Apologies for that the technical glitch. We're back. One of the chapters that is not fully explored in Belize deals with the arrival of the Spanish, but archaeological and documentary evidence points to the presence of a Spanish Christian church at Lamanay. Ironically, today we call that place Indian Church. It has been dated to 1545 thereon, and it is one of the areas that the Pacheco family led their incursions there to round up the Mayas into what would eventually become encomiendas. The surrounding communities of what is now the archaeological site of Lamanay continues to be one of the longest continuously inhabited zones of northern Belize. We find another document which has a list of visita missions. The visita missions, as you all may know, the encomenderos were required to also provide a level of Christian doctrine, Catholic doctrine to the Maya in the area in exchange for their work. I found this while researching from the Spanish archives, and it's a pity that the glare does not allow us to see the words. But the first one in the listing, in part of the graphics, has the word bacalar. And the second to last one in the second column has the word Tipu. In between, and as you can see from the transcription there, we find places like Chinam, which is believed to have been around Progreso Lagoon, Holpatin, which for many is in Orinjuak. We see Lamanay, we see Mayapan, Tipu, Soite, and Sibum. The archaeologist Thompson believes or has been able to identify these places within Belize without a doubt. Sibun today, we know it as being in the Stan Creek district, the Sibun River. Soite, the Siti River area. And when we look at other documentary records, such as the diary from Father Joseph Delgado, who traveled upriver, coming from the Verapaz region of Guatemala towards Bacalar in 1677. He notes these places and he gives distances of many of the Maya communities that were existent in southern Belize in 1677. Again, in my search, I came across another document, of 1622, which lists, and I hope I can find that one in this case. If not, I missed it. In 1622, there were encomiendas in Belize. The Spanish encomienda system allowed for peoples to acquire large areas of land with the natives for 3 generations. So it was passed on from father to son to grandson. There is a 1622 document in which 3 families are requesting an extension of those encomiendas within the areas of Camping, which Thompson identifies as Caupen, at Soite, and at Sakatan, Sakatan being Northern River. The Mananti Lagoon also appears in early Spanish maps. Sometimes I wonder how the Belize-Guatemala territorial differendum would work out if those would just be the documents taken into account. We know that that is not going to be the case because the ICJ referendum called for other specifics in it. The image here is from Tipu. The archaeological works carried out there by Grant Jones, by Pendergast, Lately, it's been Dr. Elizabeth Graham and her students who have done extensive studies at Tipu reveals that the people who lived there were a mixture. We find, as we will see from one of the, this is a transcription against Thompson and Scholes, carried out a census in 1655 in which they enumerated 239 adults, 76 young people, and 30 Indios del Monte, wild Indians. We still hear that term for some of the area, the bush areas. But these are classic examples of people such as Juan May, who was married to Ana Na, and they resided in Tipu. Bernardino Egg and Ana Q, who had 2 children, Juan Q and Susana Tut. Francisco Q, who had married Francisca Uk at Tipu. There's the case of Fernando Bo, who had been a runaway, who was residing in Tipu. Simon Khan, who married Elena Mush, and they had 1 child. I'm just skipping some of the names. But when you hear those surnames, they are typically Maya. When we look at the census records of Benque Viejo, San Jose Socots, Cala Creek, Arenal, many of these surnames continue on the listings. Ikib, a male, notice it's a full Maya name. Kalpuk, a young lady. Akanchi, Ekmas. Again, these are traditional Maya names. The spellings today change when we look at the voters' records as an example. And it makes you wonder how the people who register our children's birth paper, even our own papers, how they make mistakes. But the pronunciations remain. So that this area then of central western Belize has been populated for time immemorial. So whether our history books focused or not on the 16th to 19th century, we know that there were people occupying this zone. As I mentioned, I recommend to you books like Elizabeth Graham's Maya Christians and Their Churches in 16th Century Belize, or Grant Jones' The Conquest of the Last Maya Kingdom, which again ties into the historical backdrop of this area. Even maps, as I mentioned before, show the Spanish connection. And this is a map that was used in a 1763 treaty, the first treaty that the Spanish agreed that the British could use. They had usufructory rights, usufructory concessions in the area of what is now Belize. Coming into the 17th, 18th century, we find that peoples from Yucatan and from Petén would seek refuge. That is what our books tell us, that they sought refuge in what is now northern and western Belize. We got to look at it differently. Many of these people were already here. They had relatives who traveled from one place to another. They knew the locations. They had, for whatever reasons, some of them may have interacted with the Europeans who arrived. Others sought to avoid them. And when we throw into this mix the arrival of captive Africans who were enslaved in the timber industry, then you understand how our ethnography of this area is so rich, yet it has been neglected. The historical work has been neglected. In carrying out research, I came across this map at the Belize Archives and Records Service, a map that shows how early the British were claiming lands in this area. And it is a pity that you can't see it, but this is a plan of a logwood. I'm reading on the upper right of the map. It's a plan of a logwood work on the River Belize, located by T. Paslow. Thomas Paslow. as laid down today and surveyed at his desire on June 15, 1810, by who was then the surveyor, the H.C. Duvernay. And it begins at and binds on the lower mark of Miss Clarissa Paslow, and extending 2,000 yards in a straight course on the main river, terminating at a bribri being a tree, by a line south 36 degrees west. Thomas Paslow. If you go to Bully Tree Falls, you also have Paslow Falls. And then there's the young lady's name, Clarissa Paslow, at Clarissa Falls. These are things, these are stories that have been neglected to our own people in this area. And here's an opportunity. Gwen is not here because Chena is her grandmother and they run Clarissa Falls Resort. But here's an opportunity to create some sort of a museum, some sort of a tour of that area in an effort to promote our history, to make our younger generation know more about our history. Similarly, through the mid-1800s, we find that in Western Belize, a series of communities would arise. San Jose, Chunbalche, Hololtunich. Three of these continue. We know that there's continuous archaeological works being done there by the likes of archaeologists like Jason Eager and many others. The areas of San Pedro Cities, Santa Cruz, Santa Teresa, and Chorro. Chorro in particular is just outside of Bully Tree Falls, a short distance away from El Pilar. On the other side of the border, there were places like Holmul, Yaloch, and Yashha. And I remember stories from my grandmother speaking about going to Flores Petén and having to do a stopover at La Laguna de Yashha, which is about 30-35 miles from where we are, across into the Petén, around Macanche. Those areas around the Rio Hondo, the Blue Creek, the Rio Bravo, New River Laguna, and Hillbank were populated. Areas around Laboring Creek, Pescador Creek, and Yolgyal Bank, we find a lot of these references in some of the same people who acquired lands in Belize, as well as from the Spanish priests, the Franciscan priests coming from Merida to mission into the Petén area, but they would come into Belize. Recently, I had a friend from across from Flores Petén, our good friend Luis Jose Hernandez, who provided me with a copy of an 1862 original marriage and baptismal record. I was able to photocopy it, to scan it, and it's one of the works that I intend to do, to transcribe that material. A lot of the surnames of peoples in northern and central and western Belize appear there. I just did a precursory look at it. But these are things, again, that our story has been neglected. At least at this point in time, there are several of us who have an interest in finding out more and bringing this into the forelight. Resettlements in central, northern, western Belize, we find places like people who came from Chan Santa Cruz were known as the Cruzob. Almost every community, every district in this area has a place called Santa Cruz in honor of the communities that the peoples came. The church, we can see the effects of the impact of religion, of Catholicism, where the Maya and the Christian cross converge into one syncretic practice. The area that we are in, just maybe about a to your farm is about how far, Mayor? About 2 miles. The guy that I went over some time ago, and there is the shape of a cross. Stones piled up in the shape of a cross. The story of our chicleros in this area is that whenever they would go to the Chiquibul, they would always stop there, light their candles, and pray to La Santa Cruz. As you come into this area of Chapel Hill, the zone down there is known as Santa Cruz. Who brought that here? Again, these are little stories, we can say, micro histories that need to be brought into the forelight. We know that the people who settled in Benque in the mid-1800s were a mixture of Cruzot, Icaiche, and Pacificos del Sur. While everything focused in Belize City, the metropole, the British authorities, and their reports from Superintendent Frederick Seymour, who, by the way, endorses the alcalde system, a system that had its origins in Spain. Oftentimes we think the alcalde system began with the Maya communities. No, this was imposed by the Spanish authorities because the word alcalde comes from the Arabic al-Qadi. The word sheriff has Arab origins. The word alcalde has now been synonymous with mayor. And so sometimes I call Mayor Rosales alcalde. In fact, I have his number listed as alcalde. But that's the way we grew up. But we see that syncretism. So at the Belize Archives and Record Services, when you look at records by Frederick Seymour, particularly in 1958, endorsing the alcalde system, something that the Maya mestizo, with the syncretic practice of the Spanish, had already adopted. And the baton that would be issued to the alcalde, that staff, as a sign of authority, reminds me of the policemen who had that little baton with the silver tip whenever they walk the streets, or especially at official ceremonies. So we see the vestiges of that. Writings by John Gardner Austin, William Stevenson, John Longden, many of these colonial figures referred to the Maya and what was going on in the areas of northern, central, and western Belize. In the 1970s, Dr. Joseph Palacio wrote an article entitled Buttons and Bones in Benque Viejo. Notice the alliteration, Buttons and Bones in Benque Viejo. About 2 miles from where we are on a northwest direction, there were skeletal remains that were found, included among the relics there, buttons that were from the 2nd West India Regiment. We know that the British West India Regiment soldiers were of African ancestry. What were they doing down by the area we call today La Bomba, La Pila, the Mupan River, and a short, a quarter mile away from that area is the Guatemalan boundary line. And so buttons and bones in Benque is a story that caught my attention from my early childhood days. The sociopolitical relations, as I mentioned earlier, dealing with the alcalde, looking at the magistrates that were appointed into this region of what is now El Cayo, is still yet to be fully explored, because there are many things. The area of Spanish lookout, what are the etymology, the origin of those names, the toponyms of these areas, where do they come from? Many of these have their historical backdrop, but we have taken it for granted because it is not in the documentary writings. Okay. Okay, I'm almost at the end there. So we see then that many of the Maya leaders, such as Luciano Tsuk, Marcos Canul, well known in Orinjuak especially, Santiago Pech, Asuncion Ek, Rafael Chan, and they had a female who was the secretary, Virginia Camara. Again, we don't hear about Virginia Camara as the writer of many of Canul's letters. What role were females playing in those centuries in Belize, and how those the authorities figured out? Florencio de la Vega and his foreman Claudio Manriquez, who would lead many of the squabbles between Marcos Canul and the British authorities. They would create those. The religious affiliations are there. I was lucky enough to find information from the Jesuits, Father Eugenio Bifi, who wrote a number of the marriage and baptismal records of Benque Viejo, San Jose Socots, Clarissa Falls, Arenal, San Antonio. Father Jorge Avarro, another Italian, as well as Father Bavastro, who first missioned in San Ignacio. These were some of the early Jesuits that worked here, and it's their records, some of which are available at the Belize Archives and Record Services, and others are available, Father, at the church. Right? There's the 1860-something register of marriage and baptismal records, which Father Mark graciously allowed me to look at when I was doing research some years ago. And again, we see then later on how the development, the economic impact that it had, the old sugar mill at Lamanay, for example, eventually the bringing in of railway trams into the areas facilitating the logwood. Who were the people involved? I remember speaking to Mr. Robinson, Egbert Robinson of Flowers Bank. He has since passed away. And his stories about what the logwood industry was like, going into the camps out in the Belize River Valley area. For the region of Benque in particular, Young Toledo and Company and their foreman John Samuel August eventually became the ones to control lands in this area. We see wage labor, we see how the authorities began to use the master and servant ordinance, how the wealthy, how the elite would control the workers using the advance system. Pay half cash in advance, and then you get everything else, all provisions on credit. By the time the worker comes back to town, his other 50% is already owed. What do? Well, the master and servant ordinance and its enforcement by the district magistrate made sure that any overdue debts need to be paid, and those were done by contract. And I want to end here with the boundary demarcation in 1860. Captain Henry Ray, as well as Colonel Madrazo, Manuel Cano Madrazo, had traveled up the line in 1860 when that frontier, when the boundary, when the hollow frontier, as Humphreys calls it in his diplomatic history of Belize, of British Honduras, was demarcated. That boundary line, in as much as it existed, in as much as the former foreign minister called it what? A porous border, an artificial line, continues to be recognized by both territories. Today, the OAS calls it the adjacency line, but our peoples continue to commute across the invisible border. It is the ancestors of us, it is those peoples who brought us into central and western Belize who first traversed that area. Unfortunately, their story has not been told. As George Orwell notes in his well-known book, 1984, when he penned, "Who controls the past, controls the future. who controls the present controls the past. You and I have to challenge the story that's centered only on the metropole. And I hope that at some point in time, and hopefully sooner, much sooner than later, we are going to be able to reveal the important roles that the Wild West or the bush areas that contributed to the economic and later political development of what became the nation state of Belize is going to be put forward. And so, coming back to the mantra on the radio that we heard, the new nation in Central America, in the heart of the Caribbean basin, still has our story to be researched, interpreted, and told. I thank you.
I am going to propose that we have a person that will do more history from COBEC. Sector on board. I think you'd like to do it as an oral history of the party studies.
Right.
You don't mind me to report him?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We'll work because this is what we need to do. How do we take pride in ourselves if we don't take pride in where we come from? I will be more than glad to do that. It's part of the work I used to do in and around the country of Belize with the Institute for Social and Cultural Research. We realize the potential, in fact, the value that oral history has. We are an oral society. Our elder generation, as there was a gentleman in Benque who would say, I can read, I can write, but I could sign my name. And so when I interviewed him, I said, please sign here for me. And I explained to him the protocols of oral history and why I wanted him to sign. And he did. And so it's those stories that I continue to use in my lectures, in whatever I do. And I'm glad that you know that we can do more. Yeah. Thank you.